Welcome to Handwashing 101. We're going to explore the what, when, where, who, why, and how of hand washing. I'm Gigi Fergus, and I'm going to lead us on this journey. Over the last 3 decades of my nursing career, I have worked tirelessly to champion, promote, and teach hand washing in hospitals across the United States. In this series, we'll be reviewing the why, what, when, where, who, and how of hand washing. And this video specific, we're going to talk about why. Why do we do hand washing? What's the big deal? Does it really make a difference? Well, in order to understand the why, a review of the history of hand washing is needed. Over the course of years passing, it's easy to forget how we got to where we are now. You've probably heard of the saying, cleanliness is next to godliness. Most people inaccurately attribute this saying to the Puritans or to Florence Nightingale, but really it dates back about 250 years before Florence's time. In 1605, English philosopher and scientist Sir Francis Bacon wrote in The Advancement of Learning, "Cleanness of body was ever deemed to proceed from a due reverence to God." The 1600s were the age of Puritanism, focusing on simplicity, austerity, and piety. It wasn't until 1791 that John Wesley, the founder of Methodism and the forerunner to today's evangelicalism, preached explicitly in his sermon, the sermon was called On Dress, that, quote, "slovenliness is no part of religion," unquote. Then Wesley paraphrased the poet George Herbert by adding, "Cleanliness is indeed next to godliness." So there you have it. It had absolutely nothing to do with healthcare and everything to do with being clean and appropriate when you go to church. The medical need for hand washing wasn't espoused until the mid-1800s. Now, this is where it's going to get a little gross. You just can't make up things like this, so just bear with me. In 1847, an Hungarian obstetrician named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed at his hospital that more mothers died after giving birth if they had been assisted by doctors and medical students than if they had been attended to by midwives. Now, you got to scratch your head and ask, what was that all about? What's going on? I don't understand. Well, neither did he. So through observation and investigation, he determined the cause of this was that the doctors and medical students had typically come directly from doing autopsies to the clinic to examine the moms. Yeah, you just can't make that up. That's not good, is it? Well, in order to mitigate maternal deaths, Semmelweis made the doctors wash their hands with chlorinated lime water before examining the pregnant women. He then documented a sudden reduction in the mortality rate from 18% to 2.2% over a period of a year. I know, who would have thunk it? Despite this evidence, though, he and his theories were rejected by most of the contemporary medical establishment of the time. 7 years later, a young woman of noble birth in England decided to dedicate her life to the service of others. With her family's permission and support, Florence Nightingale traveled to Italy to serve in the battlefield clinics of the Crimean War. At a time when most people believed that infections were caused by foul odors called miasmas, Florence Nightingale implemented hand washing and other hygiene practices in the war hospital in which she worked. Now, while the target of these practices was to fight the miasmas, Nightingale's hand washing practices achieved a drastic reduction in infections. She established the first formalized nursing school and taught hygiene and hand washing to her students, and this became the foundation of modern nursing. Nightingale is frequently referred to as the lady with the lamp, as she would round on the men at night, tending to their hygiene and to their needs. Interestingly enough, though, Nightingale, just like Dr. Semmelweis, was ridiculed and mocked for her beliefs. One of her basic teachings was that healthcare providers should wash their hands before and after they touch patients. For over 166 years, the standard has remained the same. Nothing has changed. We wash our hands before we touch a patient and after we touch a patient. So you know where that comes from now. In 1864, Louis Pasteur had demonstrated that he could treat milk to eliminate bacterial contamination through a process that we now know as pasteurization. Now, you're probably asking, well, what does this have to do with hand washing? Well, remember we talked about miasmas? Well, Pasteur actually identified the and defined the process of microbial fermentation. He also, by the way, created vaccines for anthrax and rabies. He's known as one of the founding fathers of microbiology and of germ theory. During the late 1890s, more medical implementations of germ theory took hold. William Stewart Halsted is considered one of the four founding physicians of Johns Hopkins. He was the first chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and he invented rubber gloves. Believe it or not, they didn't have gloves before that. He invented rubber gloves in order to prevent his female first assistant from developing dermatitis from surgical chemicals. Now you're thinking, oh, that's really nice. But actually, he later married his first assistant. So the things people do to create marital bliss, right? Smart guy, though. He also implemented standards for decontamination and sterilization of the operative suite and of the implements used. Now, it may seem difficult to believe, but it was almost a century before any new advancements in hand washing took place. Now, how can that be? You're asking yourself. I don't understand. The turn of the century was filled with great forward thinking and inventions. Well, a lot of things occupied the minds and the hearts of the world. This was the time of electricity and cars and indoor plumbing, and and then we went right into World War I and World War II. So, though through the turn of the century and the post-World War years, they were a great time of growth and innovation. It wasn't until the 1980s, 1980, I know, that hand washing awareness had a resurgence. The 1980s represented a landmark in the evolution of concepts of hand hygiene in healthcare. The first national hand hygiene guidelines were published in the 1980s, followed by several others and more iterations in recent years in different countries as well. By 1995, the CDC and HICPAC, the Healthcare Infection Control Practices Advisory Committee, now you know why we shortened it to HICPAC, in the United States, they recommended that either antimicrobial soap or a waterless antiseptic agent be used for cleansing hands upon leaving the rooms of patients with multi-drug resistant pathogens in hospitals. Prior to the formation of HICPAC by the CDC, though, the devastating effects of undercooked meat came to the forefront of the national news. Now, I was a small child when this happened, but I do remember and recall the impact that when we found out that 73 different Jack in the Box locations were linked to E. coli outbreaks that sickened over 700 people in 4 states, led to 171 hospitalizations and 4 deaths. Now, the investigation into the outbreak eventually identified 5 slaughterhouses in the US and 1 in Canada as possible sources of the bacteria, but the exact source of the contaminated meat was never pinpointed. Further investigation, though, revealed that the parent company of Jack in the Box had been warned by local health departments and its own employees. They warned them that the hamburgers were being undercooked, but Jack in the Box had decided that cooking them to the required 155 degrees, they thought made the hamburgers too tough. As a result of all of this, we saw the implementation of compliance lines and 1-800 compliance phone call hotlines in different companies. We also, this was about the time that we started seeing those little signs in the hospital or in the bathrooms of restaurants that said all employees must wash their hands. So because of this, we did see improved hygienic standards throughout slaughterhouses and restaurants across the US. Through the 1990s, we became more aware of other transmittable diseases such as hepatitis and HIV. Hand washing and minimizing contact with contaminated bodily fluids and surfaces was emphasized. More portable forms of hand hygiene were sought after, resulting in the use of alcohol-based gels and foams. In 2002, HICPAC defined alcohol-based hand rubbing, right, because it's not really hand washing, it's rubbing, as the standard of care for hand hygiene practices in healthcare settings, whereas hand washing with soap and water is reserved for particular situations only, gross soiling of hands. So the rule of thumb here is if you can see it on your hands, you need to use soap and water. If you can't see it, but you know you've been in contact with other things, with surfaces, people, etc., you probably okay to use alcohol foam, alcohol gels. By 2008, over 120 million children around the world washed their hands with soap and water in more than 70 countries in a coordinated effort as part of Global Hand Washing Day. Now celebrated yearly on October 15th, hand washing has become a global emphasis to limit the spread of disease and improve general hygiene across the world. So there you have it, the condensed, abbreviated, yet salient evolution of the history of hand washing. You're probably still asking yourself, okay, so what? what's the big deal? We know we're supposed to wash our hands. What's the issue? Well, our hands come in contact with germs and bacteria throughout the day. Washing them frequently halts the spread of bacteria to others, to our family, and to ourselves. Our skin is our first defense to bacteria. Any breaks in the skin, cuts, nicks, scrapes, hangnails, etc., provide an entrance for bacteria to enter our system. Body parts that are comprised mostly of epithelial cells, such as eyes, nose, mouth, your peri area, that's your privates, are particularly vulnerable since we frequently touch these areas with our hands. Bacteria and viruses have been shown to live on surface areas for several days, thus increasing our need to wash frequently. And now here in 2020, with the evidence around COVID and other infectious diseases, it's become even much more important that we continue to wash our hands. So this video, we've discussed the why it's still important. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me give you a little bit of contact information here if you need it. Thanks for joining us, and please join us for our other videos on the what, when, where, who, why, and how of hand washing. Thanks again. I'm Gigi Fergus, and my contact information there. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email.